It's a science hoax on a massive scale. We're not talking about, a few results faked for the sake of a payoff from a pharmaceutical company of, half $500,000. You're talking about a $40 billion hoax. That's what you're talking about. And it's going back to the old saying: the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it. Mm-hmm. That's what's at stake. Yeah. That's what's at stake here. You've got the science hoax. You've got the technical hoax, you've got the political hoax. It's a massive thing. It's a massive thing, and that's why you have these armies of people that are set out to protect it. And there's even this case, for example, of James Oberg, who was a NASA consultant at one time. Maybe he still is. I can't remember. And he was actually tasked with writing a book to debunk the Apollo hoax theories. James Oberg, I think he was paid like $15,000 advance to do this book, and then he said, "We're not going to do it." And they withdrew from doing it. Why would they do that? So they create this doubt and uncertainty, and then videos like this, you get accused of being not knowing any science or this sort of thing.
Well, it's conventional science. That's what they stick to, isn't it, really?
Absolutely.
Anything outside of that, it's not real science. It's not.
That's right. So, and again, you start to look into things, and you can look at the photos, as I say, the shadows. The other thing that came up a few years ago, which I put into my presentation, which I got somebody asked me at once, was can the Apollo artifacts, in other words, things left over on the moon, be seen by the Hubble Space Telescope? That would give us some verification, wouldn't it? Surely. So I checked this out. This was about 2005. I remember checking this out 2006, and you can actually work that out. That's possible to work that out, and I put that into my presentation. Basically, the way that you do it is you work out how far away the moon is, and then you work out that becomes one side of a triangle, and then you work out the size of the Apollo Lunar Excursion Module, which would be the biggest object that's there, which I think is 42 feet or something, and that becomes another side of a triangle, and then you can work out the distance, as say, from the distance you can work out what angle that would subtend, that would create. So, and therefore you can work out what the angle would be, and it comes out whatever it is, 2.02 times 10 to the minus 7 degrees, or whatever it is. 10 to the minus 9, is it? Yeah, I've got this figure here anyway. 6.26 times 10 to the minus 7 degrees is what the angle of the lunar module would subtend at the eye, the position of the Hubble Space Telescope, within a margin of error. And you can actually compare that to the resolving power of the Hubble Space Telescope, which I actually found two different figures for. And it's given us so many seconds of arc, like whatever it is, 0.05 seconds of arc or 0.014 seconds of arc, I think it was. So anyway, from that you can basically work out that the Hubble Space Telescope could not see the Apollo artifacts. So you then have to go to what I mentioned earlier, and I mentioned this in the last talk we did, Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. Now that was a lunar probe that was sent up, I think, in 2009 or 2008. Yeah, it was launched on June the 18th, 2009, and it had a high resolution camera, and they've had pictures from the moon with less than 1 meter per pixel resolution, I think. So each pixel on the picture is less than 1 meter on the ground. So it's quite small objects that you can see. And in 2009, was it? I think it was August 2009. To great fanfare, they said, "Oh look, we can, we can see the Apollo lunar excursion module, the lunar reconnaissance orbit, and this was the image that they showed. So that was the lunar reconnaissance orbiter image. You've probably seen that.
Yes, yeah.
And you think, really? Wow! That's amazing. That's so clear. I mean, you can see. Oh, actually, you can't see anything. You can see a big white blob. And 3 smaller white blobs, and another blob that's sort of merged into it. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'd taken the UFO image and I'd gone to look, there's my picture of UFO, there's my picture of a UFO. What do you think they'd say? They'd say, I don't see anything in that. What are you done about? Take it back. Chuck it in the bin.
An authoritative says it is. We must believe it.
Oh yeah,
Exactly.
of course.
Exactly. Now, of course, going on from that, people say, "But Andrew, that's an old picture. That was the first attempt. It wasn't very good. It wasn't very good. They've taken a better one now." And you can go and look at the images of the Apollo 16. I think it's Apollo 13. Anyway, they've taken pictures of at least one other Apollo craft, allegedly when this thing was either in a lower orbit or a closer orbit or whatever. And those pictures do actually look fairly convincing. They do look like a real Apollo craft. So they made it. I do think those photographs have been airbrushed, because I'm pretty sure.
They can easily do that at the end of the day.
Yeah. And we know that they've done it with other things. They've actually admitted it, because there is a famous shot, and I think Richard Hoagland has talked about this, of them playing golf. It's in Alan Shepard's book, and they actually admitted that they faked that image, the Alan Shepard golfing shot. They faked that. They've admitted that, because they wanted to, get a picture of a golf ball in the shot or something, and they couldn't otherwise with that lesson. Why would you go and play golf on the moon?
That's right.
Why would you want to have a golf ball? Is that because Freemasons like golf, is it? So that's another thing. And basically what I did was, and well, it wasn't really me particularly that did this, but Gerard White, if you compare some of these lunar reconnaissance orbiter images with some of the images from Earth orbit, which were taken by a satellite called GeoEye, which should have equivalent resolution, the GeoEye images look a lot better than the LRO ones. But if you look, they're supposed to be at basically the same resolution, around about 1 metre per pixel, something like that. And so Gerard White's done a video about that, comparing the GeoEye images with the LRO images. And NASA should have the best camera technology, apart from, of course, the Black World, but that's another story. So people can look at those as well.
In an earlier LRO video, I also brought up the GeoEye-1, a privately owned Earth-orbiting satellite. GeoEye-1 orbits at 700 kilometers and by all accounts takes better quality images than LRO can do at 50 kilometers. Here's a photo of Rome, taken by GeoEye-1. If we zoom in, it becomes immediately obvious that GeoEye has perfectly resolved cars, buses, even individual people walking the streets. Here's another example, this time showing Quelimine Seaport. Again, we can resolve cars, and even shipping containers and tiny boats. I didn't look at all the images, but there are many of them that perfectly resolve puny objects like cars and trucks and buses. The LRO pictures look even more pixelated than before compared to these. I like this photo in particular because it really pones NASA's arse. Here, we see a GeoEye image of Cape Canaveral, showing one of NASA's shuttles on the pad. The image not only resolves the tiny cars, but also the shuttle stack. Oh sure, a space shuttle is much larger than a car, but we can clearly resolve the nose cone of the solid rocket booster. Each solid rocket booster has a diameter of 3.71 meters. And there is not a single doubt that that's a solid rocket booster. And how about the cars? Cars on average are about 4.6 meters long, and we can clearly make out the windscreens, windows, hoods, trunks, etc. The descent stage of the LEM is 4.27 meters wide, 9 meters wide if you count the landing gear span. But all we can see in these photos is white pixelated junk. By any definition, the lunar modules should be immensely clearer in these LRO images. LRO was 50 kilometers above the lunar surface when taking these pictures, and GeoEye-1 was over 600 kilometers above the Earth when it took its pictures. And yet, its pictures are clearer than LRO's. Comparing the GeoEye-1 to the 25 kilometer LRO orbit images, it does appear the landscape may now be of better quality. But the artifacts are a different story, because by all accounts, GeoEye-1 still takes clearer images of the cars than the LRO can do of the rover. And that's despite being 28 times further away and looking through the atmosphere. It certainly leads one to wonder, what the hell is going on here?
And then, people ask about the spacesuits. That's another one that comes up. And we already talked about the heat issue. Now, the spacesuits were liquid cooled. Apparently, they have some liquid coolant in them. And there's calculations being done about the amount of heat that would be incident onto the spacesuits from the solar radiation. That would be so many joules of energy. And then you can work out how you would dissipate that heat. Also, you'd have the body heat of the astronauts themselves that would need dissipating to keep them cool. And the only way you're going to do that is to eject vapour from the suit pack. So you need to eject vapour from the suit pack with the heat in that vapour, which would then be discharged into the vacuum around the moon. So you could work out how much vapour would need to be discharged per hour or whatever, or per minute, to dissipate that energy. Because you know that water has a specific heat of 4.2 joules per gram per Kelvin, which is what I remember from my physics classes. That tells you how much heat a glass of water can hold, specific heat. And then you look at the latent heat as well, which is what the heat of evaporation, that sort of thing. So you factor in all those calculations, and you look at the actual alleged volume of the water that they carried in these suits, and again, you start running into problems. To keep these suits as cool as they needed to be kept, they couldn't have had enough water with them to do it. Right. By certain calculations. And again, people will argue about these calculations, but from my understanding, couldn't do it. You couldn't do it, not with the way that these suits are supposed to have worked. So you run into problems with that. While we're on that subject of the suits and that sort of thing, there's been a photo that's been circulated around saying that if you look at this Apollo spacesuit boot and there's footprint on it, and you look at the footprint on the moon, it's different. It can't be the same boot. Well, that is correct. It isn't the same boot, because the boot that you see in this picture is not the overboot. That's the inner boot from the suit, because it had an inner boot and what they called an overboot, which is what they allegedly used to walk on the surface. So that is disinformation. In other words, I still don't think the Apollo went, and I don't, I do think the suits were part of the hoax as well. But that particular thing, that observation is wrong. It's incorrect. So anyone that sees that about the overboot, that's a bit of disinformation that's circulating. In other words, they circulate that. Apologist comes across it. Oh, that's rubbish, because that's the inner thing, and what Armstrong was wearing was the overboot, and they debunk it, and then so you discredit yourself because you don't know what you're talking about. So that's why those things.
Do
are
you think
out
that
there.
happens in a lot of things? They'll
Yes.
put in something that can be debunked, and then that just
Happens all the time.
dissipates everything.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
Yeah.
And I've fallen foul of that from time to time.
I think
So-
everyone has at
Yeah,
one point. Most people.
yeah.
At one point,
But if you try and be on your guard, then you can avoid some of those pitfalls.
Can I also ask about the dust side of things? Because obviously the moon is apparently dry, and yet there's prints in there, so it obviously needed moisture.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, again, that's argued, and I made this point in either on a forum or in a YouTube video or something. Like you say, that if you look at the famous first footprint image, surely that looks like it's been made in wet sand almost, or flour. Flour seems to be quite a good analogy, because flour is even finer than sand, isn't it? Than wet sand. But flour, again, because it's an organic thing that's been produced in a mill and it absorbs water from the atmosphere, that's got a slight amount of moisture in it. It's not like moon dust where there's really no moisture. So, like you say, if you go onto a sandy beach and you try and put your boot print into the dry area, it's okay. And when you're going down to where the tide's gone out and stuff, you can see a footprint in there, or a tide track, or whatever it is. But you can't see it in the dry area. That gives you a bit of a problem. But then I posted this on a forum or something, as I said, and someone said, oh, you should try doing this in Antarctica, because when it's cold and when you have this certain type of dust, yes, it can behave like that. And I'm not really convinced. I'd like to see it. I'd like to see that done properly, because again, if they've got this sort of, I mean, if you look actually at this lunar dust that they see in the pictures, it kind of looks like cement to me, doesn't it? It's that sort of consistency and colour, doesn't it? It looks like cement. It may well have been cement or something akin to that. So that cement has a little bit of moisture in it. You know, again, that doesn't. And that causes the grains to bind together more than it would if it was completely dry. So there is that factor. I don't regard that as a slam dunk, but I do think, yeah, maybe that's another thing we need to be thinking about. And Jim Collier, he observed on this topic of the dust. If you watch the lunar rover videos and the dust that they kick up, he observes that dust should have gone up 3, 4, 5, 6 times higher than it did. It should have been like, 5 foot in the air, and it only goes up. In other words, you speed up those lunar rover videos and they look like they're shot on the Earth, as do the astronaut videos. If you speed them up by a factor of whatever it is, 2 or 3.
I've seen that,
Very peculiar that they do look like they're on the Earth. And they're not jumping that high. They're not jumping that high. And then people say, and in fact this came up quite recently, they did this experiment on the moon with the feather and the hammer, and one of them had the hammer and one had the feather, and they dropped them and they fell at the same speed, and that wouldn't happen on Earth because of the air resistance. Well, if you watch David Percy's video, he reproduces that experiment on the Earth. You just have to rig it so that you get a feather which is actually is weighted. The stem of it is made out of a heavier material than the one in a real feather, and it can look quite realistic. So there are ways to rig that. And why would they take a feather and a hammer to the moon? Why would they do that? Why would they need to demonstrate that? It's kind of a bit overkill. You can one say, they would need to demonstrate that as a science experiment for school children. Maybe they would, but I'm not totally convinced by that explanation.
And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the 2 of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that?
This is also a very difficult image to fake.
Well, actually, it isn't at all difficult to fake. NASA itself would repeat the very same trick, this time officially in the 1999 story From the Earth to the Moon. This time the actonaut held the hammer the other way up, so that we could see it was not the same fakery as the first time. Of course, that original demonstration by Apollo 15 doesn't in any way prove that it had taken place on the moon. Before NASA reenacted the whole thing officially, we had already conducted our own experiment. Here we are in our London studio in 1G, complete with an atmosphere, and without the benefit of a vacuum chamber. There they go. As you can see, the feather and the hammer arrive on the ground at the same time. Now if we slow it down by the appropriate amount, lo and behold, these 2 items fall nice and slowly as per a 1/6 G environment. This illusion is all about calibration.
The only reason they'll need to do it is to try and prove that they went,
we're here.
in a way, just in case it comes up,
Exactly.
Because I suppose in 1969, and that obviously before internet, it would have been easier to cover it up because of the lack of information that people could obtain.
Right.
Yeah.
They probably didn't realise at that point that the internet would come along and we can check all this out ourselves now. So,
and the other thing that's come up as well, some people have looked into, was the nature of the Freemasonic influence in all the Apollo missions and the symbolism. The Masonic influence, and Hoagland talks about this in the Dark Mission book, which it's worth a read if people want to read Hoagland's Dark Mission book, but I think I might have said in the last video, Hoagland believes that the Apollo went to the moon. He believes that they started the hoax theory so that they could cover up what they found on the moon. Because that's his take on it, but I'm pretty sure Hoagland is wrong about that. And the structures that he's identified are part of the backdrop in the studio, So the assumptions that he's made on many of the Apollo pictures, although he doesn't exclusively work with the Apollo images, he uses some of the lunar, what's it called? The lunar probes. I'm trying to remember the name of them. It's called like lunar. It's called lunar orbiter probes. The 1960s lunar. He references a couple of those images, saying that you can see these structures and glass domes and stuff. So I don't buy it, Richard. And I've had other people. In fact, Ken Johnston is another one who said he worked for NASA. He said he's got these images and he's worked together with Hoagland to enhance these images from the originals and stuff. And he says that there's these shard and the glass domes. I talked about that in Secrets in the Solar System a little bit, not in great depth, but I don't think it is. I think what they're identifying is artifacts in the backdrop. That look like structures, and that's because they are, because they're part of the backdrop that's holding up the black screens or whatever it is. And I think, and that's what Jay Widener says. Because then we start to get into, well, okay, so let's just go with the idea that these films were shot in a studio. Where were they shot? And this is something that Bill Kaysing talked about a little bit, and he thought they were shot in Area 51, which sounds like the obvious statement to me. I don't know where they were shot. But then we look at who shot them, who was involved with shooting them. And as you know, the name that came up, and in fact we found out that it was Bill Kaysing that first brought this up, was Stanley Kubrick. And it's you cannot deny, whatever you think of the idea, you cannot deny that 2001: A Space Odyssey, which had large, important sequences which were shot on the moon in the storyline, where they dug up this monolith on the moon. And that came out, I think, in 1968, 2001, so a year before the alleged moon landings. And Jay Wiedner has written quite a lot about this, and he's made 2 films called Kubrick's Odyssey, and it might just be Kubrick's Odyssey 2, it might have another subtitle I can't remember. And I talk about that in the presentation as well that I did, because I put this back together back in 2010. And this was also brought up in this very strange documentary which Carl James talked a bit about in one of his presentations, called Dark Side of the Moon. It was made in 2002 by a French guy. I don't know if I've got the guy's name here. He was a producer. And he goes on about Kubrick wanting a special type of camera and lens to make his film Barry Lyndon. I can't even remember what Barry Lyndon is set, I think, in the 1700s or 1800s, and they wanted to film a lot of scenes by candlelight and not use any artificial light, because that's obviously what they didn't have, artificial electric light in those, in the 1800s and early 1800s or 1700s or 1600s. I've never seen Barry Lyndon, I don't even know what it's about, but it's a historical drama of some kind. So the idea was that the only people that had this type of camera or lens or both that Kubrick needed were NASA. So he went to them and said, can I borrow your camera? And this camera was being developed apparently for Apollo or for other space missions. And that's why, Kubrick went to them. So there's this story that because he wanted a favour from them, they wanted a favour from him. He let them use the camera, they'd help him create film of the fake landing because of his work on 2001. Now we don't know whether that story is true or not. I don't know if that's just a rumour. I think the camera did actually exist, and what they said about the camera was true. It was a very, special camera, etc., etc. It did work in candlelight, and you could get this dynamic range that the other cameras didn't have. I think that's all true. But whether Kubrick was involved in creating the hoax films, don't really know. We don't really know. And people have tried to claim that. All we know is what, for example, he appears to have encoded in his film The Shining.
Right.
If you watch the film The Shining from 1980,
Jump of the boy.
that's the most obvious one to me.
What was that? Sorry.
The boy in it, in The Shining, he's got a woolly jumper that says Apollo 11. He's got a rocket on it and everything.
Really? Okay.
It's very clear, isn't it?
Mom?
And that's one of the things which I thought was really, to me, the most obvious. There's other stuff which seems to be encoded, like Jay Weidner goes into quite a lot of explanation about Room 237 and how this was, I think, the average distance of the Earth from the Moon is 237,000 miles. It's something like that. I may have got that slightly wrong, but that's all in the Kubrick's Odyssey film, Jay Weidner's Kubrick's Odyssey film. But the most obvious one we point out was this little boy who's called Danny, and Danny is the actor's real name as well. Jack Nicholson plays a character called Jack as well. And there's this particular scene where Danny is playing in a corridor with his little toy trucks, as you were saying there, and the camera's watching him, and it's just before one of these sequences of these mysterious twins that have allegedly been killed in the Overlook Hotel appear to him as ghosts, and it's quite a scary scene. And he stands up after playing with his toys, and he's got this woolly jumper on. And as he's rising up, you see that the Apollo on the jumper it says actually Apollo 11 USA in a knitted pattern.
Okay.
And this is in 1980. It's not 1970. It's 1980. So it's not during the Apollo missions or anything like that. Or this is 11 years later. So that's a really weird one. That why should be this reference to Apollo 11? Within The Shining, it's rather unusual. And there's another one where another famous sequence where this is where Jack Nicholson has turned into this obsessed character. He's meant to be writing a book because he's holed up in this hotel to look after it for the winter when it's cut off by the snow and the blizzards and everything. And the sequence where Shelley Duvall, I think it's Shelley Duvall, isn't it? It's the co-star, his wife. I think her name's Shelley Duvall, if I've got her name right. She goes up to him to look at him working on the typewriter, and he gets really angry and he's bashing away on the typewriter, and then the camera zooms in. And it says, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." And but what Jay Weidner argues is that this all work is actually Apollo 11 work. So this is his argument. Max Kubrick was saying that because of what had happened to him, he'd been forced to work on this Apollo 11 project. It took up all his time, and he became very cut off from his family and his wife and stuff.
How do you like it?
And Weidner makes an argument for that based on other things in the film. It's quite an interesting idea if you look into it, that the idea that Kubrick could have been involved somehow with the Apollo 11 and Apollo missions fakery and getting them to set the cameras up a certain way, do the lighting a certain way, get a realistic look to the whole thing. Maybe he didn't actually do any of the production. But maybe he acted as a consultant. Maybe he was instructing somebody else. And Weidner also makes an argument that based on the plot of The Shining, because the plot of The Shining story was changed for the film from Stephen King's original novel. And Stephen King got rather upset about that because he apparently wasn't given a good reason to why the plot was changed. Again, why was that done? That's rather unusual. They changed the plot of the film. And Weidner argues that was part of the reason of that was because Kubrick was telling people by the events that he put in his Shining film that somebody he knew was murdered because of what he knew about the Apollo missions. That's what Jay Weidner argues because of the way the plot unfolds and how the characters interrelate. And I can't remember the exact logic behind it, but it wouldn't surprise me that Kubrick was party to secret knowledge, that maybe he told somebody or somebody told him stuff which they shouldn't have told him, and that person was then killed. We don't know who that person was, but that's again the argument that Weidner makes.
And obviously he'd have to, Kubrick's not going to say it again, he's not going to be say it outright.
No.
He's going to have, he's obviously not happy about the involvement and what it's affecting him.
So it's
hidden
things in there. Yeah.
Right, so I think there is something to that, and I would, if I was pushed against the wall, I would say Kubrick did know something about the Apollo fakery.
Involved some way.
Yes, he was involved in some way. Or he knew about it. He knew about they were doing it. It's well known that he wouldn't leave his estate in England. I think in the 1970s and 1980s, he became very paranoid, And like that, you know, that film, was it Full Metal Jacket?
Oh,
I think that was Kubrick's
Right.
film, wasn't it? I get those Vietnam films mixed up because there was several of them. Like, I think Full Metal Jacket was Kubrick's film,
Yeah, it was Kubrick, yeah.
and a lot of that was shot at the London Docklands, wasn't it? They had a whole beach scene that was
Yeah.
shot at the London Docklands, and they had to set it up with it like a beach, and because Kubrick wouldn't go, he wouldn't go out of the country to film it. So he did become very paranoid that people were out to get him. Why was that? You know, and this all links in with the story of Dr. Strangelove, the film that he made then, which featured the B-52 bomber. There's a whole story behind that Widener talks about. Talking about movies, there's movie references. There have been some peculiar ones. The biggest one perhaps is the Capricorn 1 film,
I've seen
which
that.
was released in the UK in 1980, but it was released in the US in 1978. And this film, Capricorn 1, I think there's a YouTube of it that you can watch. You know, it should be fairly easy to get hold of. It was, you know, endorsed by NASA. It's a NASA supported film. They supported it. What's the plot? The plot is that they're going on a manned mission to Mars in a craft that looks surprisingly similar to the Apollo craft, actually. And there's a technical issue with the development of the hardware. At the last minute, they have to pull the astronauts out and say, no, you're not going, because if you launch, you'll be dead. So what we're going to do is we're going to fake the launch. We're going to keep you here for a couple of days until you're in orbit, and then you're going to act for us like you're in orbit, and we're going to set up a studio, and you are going to then act like you're on Mars, because that's what we're telling you to do. And it's all going to be fine, you know, but you've got to stay here for 6 months or 9 months, or whatever it is, because that's how long it takes to get to Mars and back.
Houston, we are activating the camera.
Roger, Capricorn.
Houston, you should have a picture now.
We have a pretty good picture now.
Houston, I am out of the hatch. I'm on the ladder. Houston, the suit is functioning. The ladder is steady. I am 3 steps from the bottom. I'm 2 steps from the bottom.
Down to the ground, though.
Houston, I'm on the bottom step. Houston, I am going to set foot on the surface.
Ready, slow-mo.
I take this step in the journey of peace for all mankind.
Hey! Slow-mo.
Houston, I am on the surface.
Roger, Capricorn. We copy.
I'm starting to walk now. Houston, I am on the ladder.
Ready, slow-mo.
Houston, I'm stepping onto the surface.
Take slow-mo.
Houston, I am on the surface. We are going to set the flag on the surface. We do not claim this planet in the name of America. We claim it in the name of all the people of the planet Earth. One could say not only light, one could say time. You are in another time from us. The future. We will never be the same. For this moment, more than any moment in our history, has made all of the people in the world realize that we are part of a planet that is part of a system, that is part of a universe. We are a small, energetic species, capable of pettiness, yet capable of brilliance. We know how bad we can be. Now you, the men of Capricorn 1, have shown us how wonderful we can be, by showing us how high we can reach. You have crossed the last great frontier, and you have shown us what we are. People, of different colors and religions and ideologies, however, a single people. You are the basic truth in us. You are the reality. We will never let you down.
So the astronauts are not very happy about that, and they decide not to go along with it. And they actually break out of the facility where they're imprisoned, and they all get, 2 of them out of the 3 of them get shot, and one of them survives. But curiously, there's a sort of footnote to this story, in that we were contacted by I think it was either Carl James, Richard D. Hall, and me. I think we were all contacted around the same time. I can't remember the exact order in which it happened. By a chap called Alberto Gallipini, and he was doing a biography of Bill Kaysing. Now, Bill Kaysing was the guy who worked at Rocky Dam. We mentioned him earlier. He was the guy that wrote the book We Never Went to the Moon. He released that, I think, in 79, or was it 76? I can't remember the exact date. Not too long after the Apollo missions had finished. And Kaysing had actually started to work on a film script about a film where NASA didn't go to the moon, and they faked it, and he'd actually gone and bought a motorhome and gone off to some remote location with his wife and his maybe his daughter or something. The intention was to spend 6 months or a year writing a screenplay for this film. And then they'd actually found out that NASA had started to make this film called Capricorn 1, and they looked at because they basically found out about this, and they were going to challenge this screenplay that NASA, or Peter Hyams, I think was the guy that made the film, had come up with. And they were going to set up a court challenge because it looked like exactly the same screenplay that he'd got. Except the only difference was that his screenplay was the moon and Capricorn 1 was set on Mars. And it looked basically like whoever had done this had got hold of a copy of Bill Kaysing's screenplay, which had been in development for about a year. And they actually employed a solicitor, a lawyer, to take this forward. But it turned out that this lawyer found out that when he looked at when this copyright had been filed, or they'd filed some copyright on it, or they'd filed the date of the script, it had been changed and set to be before the date of Kaysing's copyright. And he felt he couldn't change that. So they'd actually forged the document to give their script an earlier date than Kaysing's. That's what Alberto Gallipini says. He's got the document which shows us that. And the statement from the lawyer, and he backed out. He says, "Look, I can't handle this case because if I go after these people, they're going to go after my family. I know that." He may have even received a threat. I'm not sure. So it looked, to all intents and purposes, like the Capricorn 1 film was perception management, as I've talked about.
I suppose they couldn't have it directly about the moon because it would be too whoa.
Yeah, definitely.
So if it's Mars, and
So in other words, they set a story in a fictional context, a bit like I was talking about the Mission to Mars film, about that being put into a fictional context, about the life coming here to Earth and stuff, you know. They were doing a similar thing with Capricorn 1 20 years earlier, you know, the same sort of thing, same sort of technique, but in a different sort of way of doing it, different sort of configuration of things. So that was part of the cover-up. Capricorn 1, I would argue, was a perception management part of the cover-up of the moon hoax. And you know, you can watch that film and see what you think of it. I rewatched it maybe last year or the year before that. It is an interesting film. The way that you know they treat these astronauts, I think it's quite indicative. These people are ruthless. They're ruthless. They will kill people. They will, you know, kill their families. You know, to keep this secret a secret.
With enough accounts to know that this is what they'll do. This is what they've done.
Yeah.
Done it before.
Absolutely. You know, there's quite a bit of other stuff. One of the other things that came out was the fake moon rock, and this was actually published in 2009, was it? Let's see, 2009. August 2009, BBC website, fake Dutch moon rock revealed. And this lump of moon rock that was given to this Dutch museum turned out to be a piece of petrified wood.
Wow.
And that was revealed by the BBC in 2009. It was Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, Edward E. Aldrin. That was released by the BBC. And they had it tested, and it's now petrified wood. Now, of course, apologists again might say, well, that could be anything really, because it could have been that somebody actually stole that. You know, one of the people that worked in the museum stole it and substituted it for a bit of petrified wood and then sold off the real thing. But yeah, maybe that's possible, but wouldn't somebody have noticed the difference in the character of this? And you're getting into the story of the rocks, for example, and you start to find out that the rocks from the moon Did they really come from the moon? Did they really come from the moon? Did Apollo really bring them back? A couple of things to think about. Well, perhaps they could have had other missions that did sample and return we didn't know about, and they brought them back secretly. They were brought back during secret missions from the secret space program, which is what I'm currently writing my next book about, which is what this hooks
I
into.
suppose they could have gone to the moon unmanned. And then
Yeah,
got
unmanned
these,
probe,
and
yeah.
They could have got them and
Yeah.
claimed it was
Yeah.
them.
And of course, the other interesting thing which people have highlighted is that Werner von Braun, he went on an expedition to the Antarctic to look for meteorites from the moon in 1965. I think it was, or 67. That's, I wouldn't say it's well documented, but there's some evidence that really did take place. So why is he going to collect these meteorites? You know. And my understanding was that quite a proportion of the rock was ground up into powder to be given to the people that were going to study it. So they're having these big lumps of moon rock. I don't think they exist. They were ground into powder, I think, so they could distribute them out and do experiments on them. You know, I haven't researched that fully, so anybody wants to correct me on that, then please feel free. But that was what I'd read some years ago. And then another one that comes up with the apologists is the laser reflectors, where they said that Apollo astronauts had left these retroreflectors on the moon. So what they can do is they know where these retroreflectors are. They point the laser beam from Earth at the moon, and then they get a beam back, reflection back. Bing! We found the reflector. Therefore, the reflector was left there. Therefore, the Apollo astronauts went there. They were the ones that left it. Therefore, the Apollo landers are real. To you. But again, you have to be careful, because it is well documented that the Lunokhod rover, which was a remotely landed rover, it wasn't a manned landing, the Russian mission, one of those had a retroreflector on it. I can't remember which one it was, but I know that it did. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
They could have, again, like with the sample and return of the rocks, they could have remotely landed the reflectors without our knowledge, one way or another. The other big one that comes up is, which somebody thankfully sent to me 3 or 4 years ago now, was an article from National Geographic magazine from 1966, I think it was, talking about reflecting laser beams off the moon in 1966, and those experiments had been done successfully in 1962. So they'd reflected laser beams off the moon, according to National Geographic magazine, as early as 1962, which is before Apollo anyway. So again,
Interesting.
that doesn't cut it anymore.
As we learned from Thomas Molloy's article, The Laser's Bright Magic, printed in the December 1966 issue of National Geographic,
4 years ago, a Ruby laser considerably smaller than those now available shot a series of pulses at the moon, 240,000 miles away. The beams illuminated a spot less than 2 miles in diameter and were reflected back to Earth with enough strength to be measured by ultra-sensitive electronic equipment.
we also established that the Soviet Union also managed to bounce lasers off the moon and back to Earth without a retroreflector. This is documented in the November 5th, 1963 printing of the New York Times. A concentrated beam of light has been bounced off the moon and detected on Earth by a Soviet observatory in Crimea. The feat, reported today by TASS, the Soviet press agency, duplicates an experiment conducted late last year by engineers of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The super-intensive beam was produced by a laser, a device that amplifies and focuses light. The principle is believed to have potential use in space communications and long-distance energy transmission. The Soviet announcement said that a laser had been installed at the focal point of the 100-inch reflector telescope at the Crimean Astrophysical Observatory. Once again, far from proving NASA's past moon missions were real, LRO has effectively shot NASA in the foot, this time by discrediting what is considered by many to be one of the strongest pieces of evidence that men went to the moon.
And even the more recent experiments they used, there was some program on about 3-4 years ago on BBC about what would they called it? What would our life on Earth be like without the moon? In other words, if the moon suddenly blasted out of its orbit, a la Space 1999, you know, what would our lives be like? And they you know, part of this was measuring the distance. How do you measure the distance to the moon? Blah blah. And they went and saw this research lab in the US where they were firing this laser, and they said, "Oh well, our super duper laser, what it does is it fires a bundle of 1 quadrillion photons at the moon." And how many do we get back? Do you think the scientist said? And the presenter said, "I don't know." And she said, 1. They get 1 photon out of a quadrillion photons back.
Dr. Russet Macmillan carries out the laser ranging at Apache Point.
So you're now sending pulses of laser light out towards the moon?
That's right. They're going to travel to the moon, get reflected, come back, and get detected by our detector.
So how much of the light do we actually get back?
Well, we're sending out about 100 quadrillion photons with each pulse. If we're lucky, for each pulse we might get back 1 photon.
1 photon back?
1 photon out of 100 quadrillion going out.
Right, so we're not talking about, you know, this obviously visible reflection. You know, you're getting 1 photon out of a quadrillion photons back. It's not that big of an amount, you know. And so what about that coming up, reflecting off a quartz crystal of a rock or something else? Is that really reflecting off a retroreflector? Also, people don't realise that when a laser beam is fired at the moon, like a beam from a torch, it diverges. So your laser beam might be 1 millimetre wide, or whatever it is, or 2 millimetres wide when it comes out of the end of your laser. Guess how wide it is when it reaches the moon? 7 kilometres. 7 kilometres. So again, how big's the reflector? It could be anywhere within. You just need some reflective material somewhere within that 7 kilometre diameter of where it's landed to get one back, surely. So it certainly doesn't guarantee it's the reflector that's reflecting it back, to my knowledge. When you look at bits of quartz that, you know, you walk along a beach and you get the odd glint, don't you? And
yeah, that's right.
You know, this sort of thing. So that again is not proof. It's not the proof that it's claimed to be. So people say, well, you can't prove they didn't go to the moon, and I will say, well, I think we can prove that actually. But even if you want to say we can't, you can't prove that they did go to the moon with these factors that you're claiming are proof either. You know, so whilst I might need to be more careful in certain statements that I make, so do you. You need to study this more carefully, because there are things that you've assumed to be true which clearly cannot be true. You know, so
I mean, there's another bit. We touched on the radiation, the Van Allen belts, of course. You know, a lot of people brought up a lot that they couldn't have gone through that, and you know, and I don't know about survive, but be affected in some way. You know.
Correct, and I mean this was again going back to Von Braun, because exactly Von Braun's mission, Explorer 1. Guess who he was working with on that mission? Dr. Van Allen. He was working with Dr. Van Allen, who said, "Oh, let's put a Geiger counter up in the capsule and just switch it on." You know, had a battery to run for whatever hours. So they basically had this Explorer 1 probe, which they knew was going to go into a fairly high orbit. And they fired that up there. What's it got in it? It's got a radio transmitter, which, you know, with an audio signal coming back from it, and a Geiger counter. So they're listening to the radio signal coming back in audio, I think, and the Geiger counter in the capsule, and it's clicking off, and it goes, and he goes mad, and that's how they discovered the Van Allen zones. So the Geiger counter in the capsule, and so the problem with going back to the thing, we can't test that ourselves, right? So why I went to that explanation was because if you go to Dr. Van Allen and read up what he said, Dr. Van Allen, he said, oh yes, we've got these belts of lethal radiation, blah blah blah. But then after the Apollo had been and come back again, he was asked about this and said, how did they get through safely? He said, well, actually, because they came and went back, it can't have been as bad as I thought it was. So it became a circular argument. In other words, he backed up the Apollo missions. He didn't become a skeptic. He didn't say, well, that's a bit weird, isn't it? Maybe he went along the party line. And he said, well, they must have gone through an area which wasn't quite so dense or something, you know. And we can't test that
No, that's no.
ourselves, but you can test the heat issues yourself.
I think
That's the difference.
Bart Bradley, I think Alan Bean, I think he interviewed about. He read that.
That's right.
He should have got shooting stars back at Retina as going through, and he was denying this at first, or saying it didn't happen. Then when he was pointing out this is what happened, he kind of, well, maybe we did. He kind of changed his mind.
Okay.
Kind of,
But that is funny. I mean, he points out how laughable it is.
Any ill effects from the Van Allen radiation belts?
No, now I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt. Maybe we did.
If you go up into orbit, you are going to get more radiation outside the Earth's atmosphere than you have in it. And as you said, one of the effects, I think the correct term is photoluminescence.
Yes, yeah.
So you, in your eyeball,
I can't remember the correct term.
Yeah, in your eyeball, as any GCSE level biology student will tell you, hopefully I hope they still teach this GCSE, you have two main parts of your eyeball. You have the front of your eyeball, in front of your iris, where you have aqueous humour, which is more like watery, and then you have behind your iris, which is vitreous humour, which is more like a jelly. So if you've ever opened up a sheep's eye, it's like jelly inside it. If you did that in your biology experiments at school. And so what happens is a cosmic ray goes through that jelly in your eye when you're in space, and it can create photoluminescence. So even, because it's a high energy particle, so even when you've got your eyes closed, you see flashes of light. And most of the shuttle astronauts see this at one time or another. I see a few of these flashes of light, and apparently can help stop you from getting to sleep sometimes, if you're trying to sleep, because you get these flashes of light. And that's what Bart Schabel was talking about, as you said with Alan Bean. He talked about that. And he said, I never saw those. you know, because they haven't been discovered then. He actually says that.
Brilliant.
Oh, really? So you didn't see them because they haven't been discovered, even though you were flying through all this cosmic radiation for 4 days, you saw none of these flashes. So, of course, that's where the story doesn't add up. It doesn't matter whether they've been discovered or not. He would have seen these flashes, even if they didn't know exactly what they were. Sure, astronauts are supposed to be scientists. I'm not a proper scientist, but I know, I can explain what caused them. I've never been on a flipping NASA training mission. So Bean should have known this, really.
It's how he changes it. Well, I could have done, but I probably didn't note it. Or didn't notice
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, it was along those lines. Like, well,
And he said, Bart Sibrel said, I think correctly, that the higher you go up into orbit, higher above the Earth, the more that you see these flashes, and this is what the NASA, I think there'd even been some kind of study on the shuttle missions to actually catalogue this, and work out what the rate was, how much radiation was higher up, and how many flashes more they saw when they were higher up. I think, don't quote me on that, but that was the sort of thing Bart Sibrel was talking about. So that story doesn't add up. The other thing which was brought out a couple of years ago was this new NASA initiative to go back to the moon, the Orion program, and they were talking about having radiation shielding, and this guy says, we haven't got sufficient radiation shielding yet. And I think, haven't you? Well, you had that in 1969, and that clicked off a lot of people. I got quite a lot of email about that when that came out 2 or 3 years ago. So that's not also a problem. And within that mission, within that video, they actually basically state they don't have the heat shield technology. They don't have the heat shield technology. And then there's another NASA astronaut who made this video for ESA, short video. Don Pettit is his name. And he says that we no longer have the technology for the Apollo missions.
I've seen that, yes.
We used to have it, now we've destroyed it, and it's difficult to build it back.
I've seen that.
Yeah, I heard about that as well, yeah.
That's how strange is that.
Why would you? What are you talking about? What are you talking about?
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
And then there's a very good set of articles on this same theme again on the Audis website by this guy that goes under a pseudonym of Phil Coots. That's not his real name. I was in communication with somebody recently who had been talking to Phil Coots actually, and he wrote 3 articles over a period of 3 years, and he talks about the projected dates for the renewed Orion mission to the moon compared to Apollo, and basically the alleged timescale for the Apollo missions was they started in 61 and they got a man on the moon in 69, which is 8 years. Now with the Orion program and the Constellation program before it, they had originally had a scheduled date from the start of the program to a manned landing of 15 years. So with all the advances in technology, it wasn't going to take them 8 years, it was going to take them 15 years just to go back to the moon. And that was scheduled to have happened in 2020 with the Constellation program.
Still not been back.
No. And this article goes into great detail and quotes from NASA's own documentation about the new Constellation and the Orion program, and looking at their mission goals and mission dates, and compares them to the Apollo mission dates, and it's like ridiculous when you look at it, the dates, like years longer. Yet we've had not just developments in computer technology, but developments in simulation technology, developments in materials, carbon fiber materials, developments in fuel technologies, yet it's taken us 2 or 3 times as long to go back to the moon. What's going on here?
They destroyed all the technology.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Simple.
Why would you do that?
And you hear stories that they've lost the original videotapes and they've lost the original photo images, or whether we've got copies online and stuff. What's going on here?
Strange.
The greatest technical achievement of mankind, and where it's amounting to what Dave McGowan called the lost technology of the 60s.
I think we should bring back von Braun. We get like a you know, what's it called? To contact the dead or something. Seance or something. Yeah.
But you know, so there are some serious problems with the Apollo record.
And like I said, they stack up, don't they?
And you stack them all up. And my conclusion is there's something else going on here. You know, obviously they needed it to make money for somebody. Siphoning money off into black programs, that was probably part of it, a big part of it. And the other thing I mentioned at the end of my talk was, well, could they get people to believe something like this on a global scale? You know, think of it as a psychological and social engineering experiment, because as we know then, colour TV was getting, you know, coming in then, wasn't it, in the late 60s, early 70s. More and more people were getting TVs. We were still at a time when not everyone had a TV. Not like now, where everyone's got a, you know, by the sort of late 80s, just about everyone had a TV. Probably even by the late 70s, most people had a TV, didn't they? You know, and then we had more TVs. You had portable TVs, then you had the pocket TVs. Now, of course, we've got the phones, so they can program people with the phone, you know, with internet videos and so forth. So I think that Apollo was, can we get away with it? Can we put this belief into everyone's brains, into the academic community, and mould and shape the academic community into a certain mindset, you know, which will help us do other things and cover up other things. I think, you know, that doesn't really get talked about. I don't think Bart Sibrel talks about that. I don't think David Percy talks about that. The social engineering side of it, that was part of the experiment. You know, that was the goal. You know, the goal of these people, and they had to do this.
A lot of people say, there must have been a lot of people involved. How they cover that up and you know, and all that.
Yes.
And then with the Project Paperclip and Nazis coming, they brought a way of doing this, like decompartmentalising.
Correct.
A project, so they could do something on a grand scale, but not everyone will know the big picture, so they can get away with it. And I think that's what they do basically with this.
Compartmentalisation was some of it, you know. And people commonly said, I'd rightly observed, that's the other one which I haven't mentioned. That how could they have kept it covered from like the 100,000 people that were involved? But that's not how it works. You don't need to, you know. If you can create a consensus, it's the same thing that we talked about before, the life on Mars thing. You can create a consensus that there probably isn't life on Mars. Everyone else will go along with it. You know, you can create a consensus that Al Qaeda did 9/11. When you look at the evidence, there's no way.
You could put it on a lot of things, can't you?
And it's exactly the same.
It's a psychological operation at the end of the day.
And as I think it's Bill Kaysing that put this into his book, there was a completely separate project to Apollo called the Apollo Simulation Project. We talked about this in Richard D. Hall's program, and there had to be an Apollo simulation program, whether it was real or not. You couldn't just go there in one go. You had to do some form of simulation before you actually did the real thing. That's where the way all projects like that work, and always will. You know, so if you can get such a good simulation that you can convince people that it's the real thing, it's really not that difficult to do. And you know, the test and transmission satellites that went up, and you know, they sent these up to test that they could receive signals from space and process them. You know, why not route that from you know ground-based systems up to the test satellite, back down again? You think it's coming from Apollo. Goldstone can pick that up in Australia. Think it's coming from Apollo. You know, they could have sent an orbiter around the moon. I do think the orbiters are real, as I said in the last talk. They sent the lunar orbiter up in the mid-60s to look for landing sites. Why couldn't they piggyback onto that, some radio transmitters, and get the voice signals to appear as if they were coming from the moon, and also the radio amateurs could pick them up on Earth from the right position in the sky? They could have done it. They could have done it because they'd sent probes up. You know? They could have easily done that, and that would then give the illusion that those astronauts were really going around the moon when they weren't. They were in low Earth orbit or tucked away somewhere in Area 51, talking into a microphone and beaming that signal to this probe that's going around the moon. It's all doable. It's all doable.
I also think that, you know, Neil Armstrong's prophetic words were almost scripted as well. You know,
Yes.
one giant leap, like it just seems too Hollywood.
Too pat, doesn't it?
American Dream.
Eagles landed. All these kind of things. It just seem to.
You know, I mean, just to go on to the point of, once the Apollo craft went out of your sight, you know, because once you get beyond a few hundred miles of the Earth, maybe 1,000 miles or something like that, most of the ground-based telescopes would not be able to see the craft. You cannot see it. It's too small. A telescope cannot resolve it. So once the craft gets beyond that point, all you've got is radio communications to verify it. You have no other source to verify it. You know, so that makes it easier to run a deception to deceive people. You can, and even the first mission, for example, the TV channels had to take their cameras into mission control and point them at the screen. Right, in the first mission, they didn't have a direct video feed from NASA systems into their own TV networks. They had to literally physically take a camera to NASA and point it at the screen in the first mission. That's why the images look so useless in the first mission. I think later they got a direct video feed of some kind, but that's another thing people don't realise. So
I think we'll have to wrap up. Wow.
Well, thank you.
It's incredible. I think it's really shed a lot of light on.
I've had a lot today.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so much. Yeah. Yeah, brilliant.
Well, thanks for listening, and thanks to your viewers for having to think about it.
Yeah.
Say, watch the videos. Think about it. Not only think about it, but once you've understood what happened, think of the implications of it. And remember those implications.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming along, Andrew.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Another fascinating talk. Another one that we could have gone on.
Oh, definitely. Absolutely.
But one battery's failing. I think another one's coming. So but fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's one small step